The question today is this: do you think that I can't? Do you think that I could not? And he goes on and says more. If you know the question, it's, do you think that I could not at once ask my Father and he would send legions of angel armies to defend me? But I shortened it. Do you not think that I could do that? It's a sense of doubting Jesus. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the way that we doubt God's power, often because of the way God uses his power. And that made me think about power. Where does power come from? And around here, of course, the primary answer would be coal, power plants, right? It's probably a third of our church is employed through power plants, or has been before retirement. That's a big part of the power systems that we operate under in the United States, coal power. But there's other stuff too, right? There's battery power, and that's becoming increasingly popular anymore. I see more and more Teslas. I saw a Cybertruck the other day in Gallipolis. You've probably seen it too. I won't give my opinion on how it looks, but to each their own. No offense if you drive one. We're glad you're here. God loves all of his children. There's ancient power, right? When you drive through Bob Evans Farms, you see that old windmill, and it reminds you, like, yeah, in Indiana, there are these modern windmill farms all over the place with the blinking, creepy red lights for miles and miles. If you've never driven through Indiana at night, it's a little weird. But those windmills have been around for centuries, right? Windmills, just an ancient way of finding power, even through the natural resources. Solar energy. We have solar panels popping up everywhere, all around. People putting them on their homes. You have nuclear energy. You have that movie Oppenheimer, which I personally thought was a great movie. It was really long, but it was really good. And just remembering the threats of nuclear power and the dangers of nuclear warfare. Just power. The more you think about it, power is dangerous. In fact, it seems like the greater the power, the more danger is involved. That's why I don't touch a lot of the electrical stuff in my house. I mean, I'll change out an outlet or something, but I'm not going to reroute all the Romex cable from the breaker box through the home without someone who knows what they're doing helping me, because I'm not a licensed electrician, and I'm afraid I will shock myself. Whatever source we get our power from, I still cling to the words of Uncle Ben that he spoke to Spider-Man so eloquently. With great power comes great responsibility. That's good theology. With great power comes great responsibility. That's a cheesy superhero line, but it's true, right? The more power you have, the more responsible you need to be. Who would you say has the most power in the universe? And this is church, so the first thought is probably the right one. Jesus. That's a great answer. You could also say God. You say the Lord. Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think if one being in all the universe has ultimate power, it's God, the one who made and sustains the universe. So we would argue that God must have the greatest level of responsibility because he has the greatest level of power. The text today in Matthew 26 is Jesus basically saying to the people around him, don't you realize that I have all power? I've been telling you, the Son of Man has come with all power and authority from heaven. He's been telling them he has the power. The problem is the way he uses it. They're not understanding. If you have the power, why aren't you using it the way we would use it if we had that kind of power? And what Jesus is trying to teach is a lesson in responsibility, which is kind of a lame topic for a sermon, but I think it's helpful, okay? Responsibility. Matthew 26, 47 through 56. That's our text. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, beginning in verse 47 and reading through verse 56. So Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, or leaving the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I kiss is the man. Seize him. So he came up to Jesus at once, and he said, greetings, Rabbi, and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. Then they came up and they laid hands on Jesus and they seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels. But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day, I sat in the temple teaching, and you never seized me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all his friends ran away. The disciples left him and fled. It's a sad story. It's also a frustrating story because most of us would align with Peter and not Jesus in this account. Many of us are waiting for Jesus to call the 12 legions of angels to fight for him. We're waiting for Jesus to tell Peter, good shot, but this time get him across the throat, right? An ear's not going to stop him. You got to kill this guy. He's going to arrest me. That was really violent. I'm sorry about that. That's not in my notes, and I shouldn't have said it. But that's where my brain goes. I'm desensitized by all those video games and rock music. So I'm a rotten person. And my brain immediately thinks, cut down the bad guys, right? Defeat the bad guys. Batman was my favorite superhero, but I was always frustrated that he just disabled people and never actually finished them off. I'm just being honest. So when I read this text, really, when you read the entire passion narrative of Jesus, there are things that stand out. The passage that we read today is prophetic, and Jesus says that. This is to fulfill the scriptures. This is to fulfill what the prophets said years ago. Centuries-old prophecies had to be fulfilled. God knew all along that this was God's plan to save the world, that he would come in human form and he would die. He would be arrested, mocked, beaten, bloodied, and crucified. Then he would be resurrected. But he had to die first. Jesus had to die. It was part of the program. It was part of what God had prepared before the foundations of the earth were laid. We know that. It is prophetic. It's part of God's plan. But it's also comforting. Because Jesus essentially is saying, don't you realize I could destroy everything on earth? I could destroy every last one of you if I felt like it. The comforting part is that he doesn't feel like it, right? He could destroy you, but he doesn't. And that's because he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to destroy you. He wants to save you. That's comforting. And by extension, it's prescriptive or instructive. If Jesus came to save and not to destroy and condemn, John 3:16 and John 3:17, if he came to save and not condemn and destroy, then he encourages his disciples to follow his path, to come to save and help and build up, to redeem, not to destroy. So then it's instructive to us. We should not seek to destroy people. Instead, we should hope that they be saved, that they be redeemed. It does all those things. Jesus, in this story, could have led a rebellion. His friends waited for him to. I've often wondered if Judas was the betrayer, not because he was just some money-grubbing punk, just like, 30 pieces of silver. Yeah, who cares about Jesus? The 30 pieces of silver is a lot, but it's not enough to change the character of a man. I think Judas followed Jesus because he was ready to see a rebellion. He was ready for revolt, for revolution. And when Jesus refused again and again and again to fight back, Judas finally said, forget it. And he took the money and said, I'll force him to fight back. I'll lead the enemy right to his doorstep with clubs and swords and then see what he does. I think the most disappointed person that day was Judas, because he thought for sure this will make Jesus take action. He will finally do what we've been waiting for. He will fight Pilate and Caesar. He will bring us redemption as the Jewish people. And Jesus says, put your sword away, Peter. Judas, do what you came to do, friend. That must have hurt. It's a weird story, but it's definitely a challenging one. Jesus could have led a rebellion. He could have called legions of angel armies to his aid. He could have overthrown the powers of our present world by force. So why doesn't he? That's the question. Why doesn't he? And that makes me think of another passage in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 53. And I'd love for you to turn there. There's, I think, 12 verses that I want to read. Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 12, which I think is just the whole chapter. Yeah. This is one of the songs of the suffering servant in the prophet Isaiah. It's powerful. I had to memorize this in Bible college. And it's stuck with me ever since. This is prophetic. It's pointing to Jesus. He is the suffering servant who is also the anointed king, the Messiah. He's both. He's the Lion of Judah, and he's the Lamb that was slain. He's both. And Isaiah 53 captures it pretty powerfully. So I hope you've turned there. Isaiah 53, verse 1. Who has believed what he's heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? The arm of the Lord, by the way, is a Hebrew idiom for power, like if you flex your bicep, something like that. It's the arm of the Lord, the power of the Lord. To whom has the power of God been revealed? And then we find out what the power of God looks like. He grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs. He carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Yet he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, but he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers remains silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, meaning his future children and grandchildren, who considered he was cut off out of the land of the living, meaning he never had any. There'd be no more Jesus. Once he's dead, he's gone. He had no wife, he had no kids. That's it. Yet he was stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. You remember he didn't have any offspring, right? So something has changed. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. He will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he will divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out his soul to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and he makes intercession for the transgressors. It's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. That's Isaiah, the prophet, but we see it elsewhere. I think of Revelation. When everyone is postured for the battle of Armageddon, in Revelation 16, we see they go to the mountain of Megiddo, which is a valley. It's a bit confusing, but it says they've all postured for war. You sort of had Team White and Team Scarlet, the good guys and the evil guys, and they're ready to fight, and they're all gathered for battle. And then it says he shows up on a white horse, and he's got King of Kings and Lord of Lords on his thigh, and he has this sword that comes out of his mouth, and it's a picture of a word. He speaks a word, and all his enemies are slain instantly. There's not even a battle. Some of you didn't know that, but there's no battle in Armageddon. He just shows up and speaks, and they fall down. And the birds feast on them. Like they're done, they're gone, they're destroyed. Just with a word. He never pulls out an actual sword. He never leads a real army to fight anybody. He does no violence. He merely speaks with the sword of truth, and his enemies are vanquished. Why doesn't he fight? But we know this, right? We know because earlier in Revelation 5 and 6, we see the Lion of Judah. And we turn to the throne room of the Lion of Judah. And then it says, John looked into the throne, and seated on the throne was not a lion, but a bleating lamb, as if it had been slain. Because this too is God. He is all power, the Lion of Judah. And yet he's a bleating lamb that's been murdered. Both at the same time. It's a crazy thought. The images in Revelation are pretty crazy. They're wild. But there is a continual theme. The patient love of God. This desire to see his enemies turned into friends. This patience that says, I could destroy you, but I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, trying not to. waiting for just a few more to repent, just a few more to change their minds and join the right team. This patient love of God. Why won't he just fight? Why doesn't he just come now and wipe out all of our enemies? Why make Peter put his sword away? Why not take Pilate and Caesar on one-on-one and destroy them? He's Jesus. He could do it. The Gospel of Matthew says over and over and over again, he could do it. But then he never does. He just won't do it. He won't fight the way we want him to. Why doesn't he fight? And I think it's because Jesus is revealing something to us about power and about responsibility. I have 5 points this morning. I usually don't have points in my sermons, but I do today. 5 points. The first point is this: the misuse of worldly power. The story of Jesus' arrest highlights how power in the world is often misused. The religious leaders and the Roman authorities conspire under the cover of darkness to arrest an innocent man, Jesus, who had done nothing wrong. That misuse of power reflects the fear and the insecurity that drive humans to do things that are so weird, so stupid at times. Power is pursued for selfish gain rather than for righteousness. We have to be cautious how we use the power that's entrusted to us, making sure it aligns with God's truth, with God's plan. But in this world, power is often misused. Second point, true power lies in peaceful surrender, not force. Now, you've heard that before, not just from Jesus. You've heard it from Mahatma Gandhi. You've heard it from Martin Luther King Jr. You've heard it many times from many people. Some of the most influential, world-changing people you've ever heard of have held this belief that true power lies in peaceful surrender, not in force. And we've seen the fruits of that labor. The early church proved it true. When they became martyrs, many of them became martyrs those first few hundred years, and the church grew like wildfire. And meanwhile, Rome sought to control and overpower people and hold on to its authority, and it was sacked by the Visigoths. The greatest empire the world ever knew, destroyed. And yet the weak little Christian church, full of poor people and women and children and foreigners, they grew while Rome was conquered. Because true power lies in sacrifice, in surrender, not in using force. Jesus demonstrated that when he surrendered to God's will through the power of nonviolence. When Peter tries to use violence, Jesus says explicitly, if you take up a sword, you're going to be slaughtered by a sword. You cut someone down, they're going to cut you down. Fight fire with fire, everyone gets burned. Jesus told him that's how the world works. Who has the bigger, faster sword? Well, eventually everyone is conquered. An eye for an eye leaves the entire world blind. So Jesus rebukes him and submits to a peaceful arrest. He even belittles his arresters. He says, you came out here with clubs and swords like you thought I was going to fight. I've been in the temple every day in front of you peacefully, and you could have seized me at any moment without any uproar. But you came out here at nighttime with clubs like I'm some evil villain that's going to fight you. I haven't fought anybody the whole time I've been around. Instead, like Isaiah 53 said, he was oppressed and afflicted, and yet he opened not his mouth. He went like a lamb being led to the slaughter silently. God's kingdom advances not through our aggression, not through our ability to prove ourselves right and more powerful than the next. The kingdom of God advances in this world through love, through surrender, through peacemaking, through humility, through trust. And that point will probably go over many of your heads. And tomorrow you'll get on social media and act like you never heard it before. Although Jesus demonstrated it and the Bible says it again and again, we just don't believe it. We don't believe that true power lies in peaceful surrender. We believe power lies in force, because in this world it seems to. Third point, God's sovereignty over human power. God is in control, despite the seeming victory of human power, even at the cross. Many moments later in the Gospels, when Jesus is in fact crucified, even then it would seem that the earth has won and the heavens have lost, that worldly power has conquered. Evil wins and goodness dies. And yet, of course, we know that's not the end of Jesus' story. He's resurrected, and he has more power than ever. And he ascends into glory, and he says, I'm going to come back and finish what I started. What did he start? He didn't start a war. He started a transformation. It's wild. God was in charge of all of this. Jesus' arrest isn't a sign of his weakness. It's not because he failed or he didn't understand what was happening. He told Judas, do what you came to do. He knew what was going on. It's not because Jesus was dumb. It's not because he was ignorant. It's not because he was weak. It's because the exact opposite was true. He was smarter, he was more engaged, more aware, and more powerful than his enemies. And so he's able to surrender to God's sovereignty. He trusted God to do what was best. Again, just like we read in Isaiah 53. The suffering servant is pierced for our transgressions. He's crushed for our iniquities. God knew this is what it would take to show his love to humanity, to convince humans that he really is good, that he loves you to the point of death and beyond the grave. He would have to go through this ordeal. He knew that's what it would take. We have to remember, no matter how powerful human authorities may seem, God is in control. In the weeks and months ahead, especially given our political climate right now, you need to remember, no matter what human authorities take control or seem to be in control, God is actually in control. And God's plan never fails. You need to believe that. God is sovereign over human power. Point 4, the corruption of religious and political power. We see in this text the collaboration between the Jerusalem leadership, the religious leaders of Judaism, and the Roman authorities and soldiers, those who serve under the prefect Pontius Pilate and under Caesar, the emperor. They come together. Regularly, these people are enemies. They don't like each other at all, but they become friends for a moment in order to do what is unjust and wrong. Their collaboration in the arrest of Jesus reveals how easily human power is corrupted. Just how easily human power is corrupted when it's disconnected from God's truth and from justice. It serves as a warning, I think, to the church and to individuals in positions of authority. Our power has to be exercised with integrity. It has to be used ethically, morally, justly, with a commitment to God's kingdom values, not a compromised agenda for personal or political gain. And I say this passionately. Nationalism is destroying the Christian church. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I mean if you think that you could promote the United States of America to the same platform as Jesus in your life and tie them together and preach them at people as if they are one and the same, you are part of the problem. I am a proud citizen of the United States, and I will serve if I'm drafted or whatever I need to do. I promise you that. But I don't think the United States is God. And I think you need to be careful not to equate the two. Jerusalem began to see the emperor as God. And so they gave in to the emperor's power, to his militant strength, to his money and resources, and they joined forces with an evil empire in order to promote their cause as Jews. But what they did was corrupt Judaism and ruin their efforts. They shot themselves in the foot. Jesus has to clean up the whole mess. He removes Roman authority and Jerusalem's corrupt authority, and he starts the whole thing over again with pure, selfless love straight from God to humanity, because all the human powers had been corrupted. That's something you could really dive deeper into if you read the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew. Point number 5, the futility of power without justice. The futility, the waste of power without justice. The injustice of the arrest of Jesus and the subsequent trial, which we would say was a kangaroo court, it highlights the emptiness of power that is not grounded in justice. Power that isn't just is futile, it's wasted, it's temporary. When power is used to suppress the innocent or push selfish agendas, it leads to destruction. You know that already. But I'm not sure we're willing to give voice to that. In our day-to-day lives, we're not quick to point it out or acknowledge it. Power used for selfish purposes, power used to suppress the innocent, is destructive, and it's futile. As followers of Christ, we're called to be champions of justice. We ensure that our actions and our influence reflect the goodness, the righteousness of God. So that's it. That's the 5 points. And to sort of conclude those, I want to say, as we reflect on Jesus' arrest in that chapter, and we think about the Garden of Gethsemane and the Passion of Christ, we're reminded that true power in the kingdom of God is not about force or domination or control. It's about surrender. It's about self-giving love. It's about trusting the sovereignty of God and practicing justice in the world. That's true power. And Isaiah 53 reiterates that, along with Matthew 26. We need to understand the redemptive plan that was at work in the suffering and dying of Jesus, because he calls us to take up our cross and follow him. We're supposed to do the same thing. He did not say, now that I've died and risen, you can pull out all your swords and cut their ears off. Now everything's changed. Now you do whatever you want. That's not what he says. He says, now you take up your cross and you get executed unjustly. When I was a kid, I was invited by a preacher one time at 9 years old to recite a prayer and be baptized and get my first Bible, and I did all that stuff. And I became a Christian that day, as people would say. I think I was becoming a Christian long before that, but it doesn't matter. That was the day on paper I became a Christian and joined the little Baptist church in Louisville, Kentucky that we went to. It was a momentous day. But I can tell you, I joined that church without awareness of what I was signing up for. Because all I thought was, I don't want to burn in hell forever, so I better get baptized and pray this prayer and start reading the Bible and go to church so that I can go to a happy place when I die. No one told me until long afterwards, now that you signed up, here's a cross. Go carry this. No one told me that. Now, I'm willing to carry it. I try not to when I don't have to, but I know I should, and I'm willing to try. I wonder if you feel the same way. Are you willing to carry a cross? What does power look like in your life? We're approaching the November elections, and everyone will ask me, who are you going to vote for? Well, they won't. They'll assume they know. But deep down, I'm a conservative libertarian, which doesn't exist, so I'm nothing. I'm the unknown. But I do believe in freedom, and I hold Christian values, and that makes it hard for me to talk about politics, because I don't think any politician nor party represents all the policies that I would represent as a follower of Christ. There's always some shortchange somewhere. No one gets it all right. So then it's kind of like picking the lesser of evils, which is a shame, but very human. Anyway, I'm not really planning to talk about that. I want to say that I am astounded every election year by the number of self-proclaimed Christians who still don't seem to understand Jesus at all. It's as if they've never read the Gospels. All the disciples of Jesus who apparently never actually studied what Jesus said or did, and then proclaimed to everyone else exactly what Christ would do and who he would vote for. People who seem to not know anything about him at all. The way he used power, the way he transformed the world around him. It's crazy. Instead of following the path of Jesus, instead of seeking the fruits of God's Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Instead, we seek power. We chase after money, fame, pleasure, leisure, cheaper gas prices, because that's what Jesus cares about. The same thing that Rome chased, the same thing they cared about, which led to its ultimate ruin. The same earthly power that corrupted Jerusalem and forfeited their work as the messengers of God. The same earthly power that has corrupted the highest offices in this great nation. And if you don't think those offices are corrupted, you're not paying attention. And I'm talking both sides of the aisle. The same things that we chase in our daily lives. Power and money and fame and leisure and pleasure. We chase these things every day. And we don't stop and think, how did that go for everyone else in human history? And maybe Jesus could give us a better example. It's just crazy. So would you stand with me? And I want to close with a parable. This will be a little different. It's a story, but it's not a parable of Jesus. It's a parable from one of my favorite preachers who's now dead. His name was Fred Craddock. I only heard him in person one time, but he's still one of my very favorite preachers. He tells this story. He says, I've never been to a greyhound race, but I've seen them on TV. They have these beautiful dogs. Well, they're kind of ugly dogs, actually, but they're very muscular, powerful dogs, right? And they're precious. All animals are precious, right? I don't mean I don't like them, but let's be honest, they're not the most beautiful breed of dog. But greyhounds are powerful, and they're fast. They run in laps chasing a mechanical rabbit around, racing. And people gamble on it and make lots of money, right? And when they get too old or injured or whatever and they can't race anymore, people put them up for adoption in newspapers and nowadays on social media or whatever. And families can take those dogs in and house them until they die of old age, right? They can live a peaceful life at home until they are no longer with us. But if you don't, then those dogs are essentially destroyed. And so Fred said he had a niece in Arizona who couldn't stand the thought of putting down these race dogs, so she adopted like 3 or 4 of them. She'd always have several at her house. And he said one time he went to her friend's house who had one that had been raised with little kids. And he went inside, and there's this big old spotted greyhound lying on the floor, and there was a little toddler pulling on its tail, and then the older brother was laying on its belly like it was a pillow. The dog was just laying there and seemed so happy. And so Fred said to the dog, "You still racing?" And the dog said, "No, I don't race anymore." He said, "Oh, do you miss it? All the glitter, the excitement of being a race dog? All the fun that happens at the track?" And he said, "No, I don't really miss it." "Well, what was the matter? Did you get too old to race?" And the dog said, No, nothing like that. I quit pretty early." And he said, "What happened then? Were you losing a lot? You're not a winner?" And he said, No, I won over $1 million for my owners. I ran really well." He said, "Oh, okay, did they treat you badly?" And the dog said, "No, I was treated like royalty. As long as I was racing, they treated me, with the silver spoon. They treated me so well. It was hard to leave." He said, "Oh, so you must have broken your leg or something, right? You got injured?" He said, "No, nothing like that. I think I still could have done well." "Then why did you quit? Why did you quit?" He said, "Well, one day I realized that the thing we were chasing wasn't a real rabbit. And I couldn't do it anymore. I quit." All that chasing, running around and around, just running and running and running and running. And for what? It wasn't even real. What would I do with it if I ever caught it? It was nothing. So Fred said, "I bet that was a big change, leaving all that behind." He said, "It was the hardest decision I've ever made. Giving up the life I had known, all the things I had valued, everything important to me, and leaving all of that behind. Yeah, it was hard, but I've never felt more free." And he put his head back down so he could be a better pillow for the little boy. What was it Jesus said? "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." Amen. As we come this morning to the Lord's table, we are reminded of what peacemaking looks like. It's not taking people by force. It's not conversion through aggression. It's self-giving love. We take the bread and we eat it because God gave his own body to feed you. And we take the cup that represents the blood of Christ because God shed his blood at human hands to save those very same humans from the blood they had put on their own hands. That's radical, radical love. But it changed the world. It saves this world. No act of violence could do that. It is, in fact, the antithesis of violence. It is the undoing of every human violence, of every human evil, of every injustice. At this table, that's what we commemorate. The love of God, the mercy of God, the redemption of God. So come this morning, if you are a disciple of Jesus, and taste and see how good God is.